Tuesday, April 10, 1900. The New York Times. 9 acres ravaged by fierce flames. Factories, lumberyards, and stables destroyed in Brooklyn. Over $800,000 total loss. 800 working people thrown out of work. The big losers. Water supply scant. Fire ravaged the south shore of Newtown Creek from Oakland Street to Seatucket Street and back to DuPont and Provost Streets and Page Avenue, Greenpoint, Brooklyn Borough yesterday morning, destroying several substantial factories and a number of wooden structures and devastating an area of about 9 acres. Of this, 7 acres were occupied by the factories, stables, and lumber yards of the principal loser, Edward C. Smith, a box manufacturer, whose chief loss was 20 million feet of lumber, worth $400,000. The total loss is about $800,000, which is less than 1/4 insured. Although an army of firemen was called into service, the only accidents were slight burns to 1 or 2 men who continued on duty. Newtown Creek and 3 fireboats checked the flames in their course north, and a fireproof building stopped them when it appeared certain that James D. Leary's lumberyard on Provost Street would be destroyed. The greatest of good fortune also saved the Brooklyn Oil Works on the north side of Ash Street, between Oakland Street and Manhattan Avenue, and the Church and Dwight Chemical Company's works at the southwest corner of Ash and Oakland Streets. The fire was first seen at 3:30 o'clock in E.C. Smith's planing mill, which was on Shawmut Street, north of Ash Street, a 3-story building next to a lumber shed which extends to Newtown Creek. Several men dispute the credit for having given the alarm, but Captain Reardon of the 61st Precinct says that it was turned in by a member of his command who was not looking for notoriety. When the first apparatus arrived, the fire was in full possession of the Smith factory and shed, had seized on the dock storehouse along Oakland Street of the Church and Dwight Company, and was menacing the large works of the Standard Oil Company, the Brooklyn Oil Works, and the main factory of the Church and Dwight Company. That the flames did not go further west than the shed of the Church and Dwight Company was due partly to the wind being from the northwest and partly to the promptitude with which Superintendent John Moriarty protected the property of the Brooklyn Oil Company by having in a few minutes 4 streams of water playing on a tank containing 8,000 barrels of oil, which was exposed to the flames from the dock storehouse of the soda factory, and other lines of hose protecting other exposed points. At the soda factory, the standing fire apparatus was used to like advantage. Chief Croker on hand. Battalion Chief Perry, on his arrival, sent out a succession of alarms, and others followed when James Dale, Deputy Chief in charge of the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, took command, so that altogether there were at the fire on land 20 engines and 5 hook and ladder apparatus, and on Newtown Creek the fireboats Van Wyck, D.A. Booty, and Seth Lowe, besides several fireboats of the Standard Oil Company. Fire Chief Croker arrived from New York shortly before 5 o'clock, and so fully approved of Chief Dale's arrangements that he gave no order and remained but an hour. Before the fire apparatus called by a 3rd alarm arrived, the fire had traveled to A.J. and J.J. Callow's coal yard and pockets beyond the Smith planing mill, out on the bank of Newtown Creek, and worked south so as to seize on the main box factory of E.C. Smith on the east side of Oakland Street, between Ash and Box Streets. This was a substantial 2-story brick structure with a towering brick chimney and an equally high chimney of riveted iron. East of it, and running toward Page Avenue, and what are known on maps as Pequod and Runton Streets over the Smith Yards, in which were 20 million feet of lumber. To the leeward of the lumber yards were first the buildings of the Long Island Coal Company and the paintworks of George W. Piper on Provost Street. Beyond the Long Island Wood Company's building was the main construction building of Post and McCord, contractors and makers of building ironwork. Beyond this, toward Whale Creek, were the storage yards, and to the south of them the immense lumber yards of James D. Leary. Opposite Piper's paint factory at Page Avenue and Provost Street were other buildings of Post and McCord, including what was known as the Office Building, a 2-story iron structure supposed to be fireproof. It was about 4 o'clock when the main factory of E.C. Smith caught fire, and it was in flames in every part of it 5 minutes later, and the lumber piles near it caught as if they were flax. The lumber yard was thus exposed to the fire from the main factory, and that from the Callow coal yard, and as pile after pile of wood was licked up, the flames traveled as a prairie fire toward Newtown Creek and the construction building of Post and McCord, illuminating all Long Island City, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, the East River, and the east side of New York, and far into Long Island. Chief Dale was assured of the safety of the district beyond Newtown Creek, as the fireboats were doing splendid work and tugboats had removed all craft in danger out of the territory west of Oakland Street, between the creek and Clay Street. He feared the consequence of the fire getting into Leary's lumber yard, and concentrated his force at Page Avenue and Provost Street, and along Provost Street at DuPont Street. Firemen driven back. This, however, soon became the lee side of the fire, and little by little the firemen had to yield ground. As the flames from the lumber yard advanced, they first seized on the blacksmith's shop and coal shed of the main construction building of Post and McCord, and at right angles to it, and then on the building of the Long Island Wood Company, running parallel with the construction building. Between the Wood Company's building and the construction building was an alleyway in which the members of engine companies numbers 16, 30, and 37 and truck company 8 were on duty to protect the construction building, which was supposed to be fireproof and was regarded as a barrier to the march of the fire further east. All of a sudden, however, the flames caught the roof of the south end of the construction building, and an arch of fire formed over the alleyway from the flames from the lumber yard, the blacksmith's shop, and the Long Island Wood Company's building. And if the firemen had not turned a corner quickly, they would have been in serious peril. On a sharp order from their commanding officer, they abandoned their hose and managed to escape around the north end of the construction building. In the retreat, 2 firemen had their hands scorched. A couple of minutes later, the alley in which they had been operating was a blast furnace. The fire in its advance on the Post and McCord construction building took a southern course, licked up the paint factory of George W. Piper, leapt Page Avenue, seized upon the office building of Post and McCord, and destroyed it, a shed, and a pattern shop and stable in a few minutes. Here the fire was checked within 50 feet of the James D. Leary Lumber Yard's office at DuPont and Provost Streets. The construction building of Post and McCord held the flames from going further east, and Chief Dale was soon able to report to Chief Croker in New York that he had the fire under control. This was at 8 o'clock. The firemen then attacked the edges of the burned territory, the fireboats attending to the fire on the edge of Newtown Creek, until all danger of further spread of the flames was averted. Then the ruins of the Smith and Post and McCord factories were looked after, and men were told to deluge the burning coal heaps in the Callow yard, and where the blacksmith's shop of the Smith and Post construction shop had stood. Some of the lumber heaps and the coal will burn for several days. Whole district menaced. Chief Dale stuck to his post until late in the afternoon. A reporter of the New York Times found him at Page Avenue and Provost Street, begrimed beyond recognition, almost blinded from smoke, and his clothes ruined by dirt and cinder burns. Acknowledging a salutation by pulling a ragged felt hat over his eyes so as to shade them, he smiled and said, "Say, 'twould be a bull place for a clam bake, wouldn't it?" pointing to the blazing wood and coal heaps. Yes, it's been a tough fire, bigger than any in this district. Tired? Yes, a little. Won't be, though, when I get breakfast. It was 3 p.m. Nothing but Newtown Creek and the fireboats and Providence prevented the wiping out of the entire district, north, south, east, and west. You see, the water supply was insufficient. The mains are too small and not properly fed. Then the wind was enough to blow the fire over the creek. But I've got to praise the men under me. They fought the fire well. Of the principal losers by the fire, Edward C. Smith is the greatest sufferer. All his buildings and every stick of his lumber were destroyed. He was much pleased at the saving of 35 horses by the police. All there were except one, which got lost in the stable and had to be abandoned. As soon as possible, the ruins of the factories and the yard will be cleared to begin business anew. A statement authorized by Post and McCord was that they had nothing for the East River Bridge or tunnel in materials or plans that was destroyed, and that only a very small part of their stock of structural ironwork was damaged. The damage to the roof of the construction building can be repaired in a few days. At the north end of this building, steam was up when the fire was under control. The firm loses much with its office building, including business and patent records. Some patterns were saved. A conservative estimate of losses is in the following table. E.C. Smith on lumber, $400,000. E.C. Smith on factories and machinery, stable, etc., $210,000. Post and McCord, $125,000. The Church and Dwight Company, $10,000. Brooklyn Oil Works, $100. A.J. and J.J. Kahlo, $50,000. G.W. Piper, $10,000. Long Island Wood Company, $12,000. Total, $817,100. The police arrangements. The police arrangements were in the charge of Captain Reardon of the 61st Precinct, who had with him his own reserves and those of the 60th and 62nd Precinct. No accident occurred, but at the beginning of the fire, much excitement among the working people in Ash, Box, and Clay Streets east of Oakland Street had to be calmed. This was done with tact, and only a few moved part of their property to Manhattan Avenue, where they kept guard over it until some of the fire engines were withdrawn. As is usual in such cases, there was gossip about the fire having incendiary origin. Neither the police nor the firemen found reason to believe this, although the start of the fire had no clear explanation. The disaster will throw about 800 people out of employment, some, as in the case of Smith's 235 employees, for a long time. An incident of the fire was the release of about 200 pigeons in a loft over Piper's paint factory. Some of them are said to have become bewildered and to have flown into the flames of the lumberyard, but the majority of them found refuge in half a dozen lofts in the neighborhood. The area covered by the fire was strung with telegraph, telephone, and electric light wires. These, with their posts, were entirely destroyed. Early in the afternoon, gangs of workmen began to restring wires to connect the district beyond Provost Street with that east of Oakland Street along Page Avenue. E.C. Smith's factory was wiped out by fire April 26, 1881, when a loss of $100,000 was sustained, and several lives were lost, and more than a score of persons were injured. Insurance loss under $200,000. Underwriters say their liability is far below total damage. Fire underwriters yesterday roughly estimated the actual liability of their companies as the result of the Greenpoint fire at less than $200,000. The insurance on the box factory of Edward C. Smith was said to aggregate $125,000, and the insurance loss on the property of Post and McCord was placed at about $40,000.